Rain
I'm
had
sorry,
fallen
Scout.
steadily for 3
I can't
days
care
in the
for you
quiet
anymore.
town of Maple Hollow,
Please,
turning the
someone
streets
love
to
him.
puddled grey and softening the edges of the old buildings along Main Street. The kind of drizzle that made people stay indoors, cancel plans, and forget the sound of children's laughter that usually danced down the sidewalks. But not everything had gone quiet. Outside a faded pink storefront with hand-painted lettering that read, "Hales Candy and Things," a German shepherd stood unmoving. His coat, once likely a proud mix of sable and black, now hung heavy with water and grime. He didn't whine, he didn't bark, he didn't chase after the few pedestrians who glanced his way before hurrying off. He simply stood, waiting. Mr. Vernon Hale, the owner of the shop, had watched him from behind the counter for 3 days straight. At first with irritation, then curiosity, and now something that almost resembled heartbreak. Vernon was not the sentimental type. 69, retired twice, and 3 years widowed, he lived alone above his candy shop with no pets, no hobbies, and no patience for nonsense. But something about the dog's stillness had gotten to him. He had placed a bowl of water outside on the first day. The dog drank. The second day, Vernon tried leftover brisket. The dog sniffed it once, then turned back to the door like it didn't matter. This morning, Vernon had stepped outside in a faded cardigan, rain drumming against the striped awning, and stared at the shepherd who still refused to leave. "Hell with this," Vernon muttered and picked up the phone. Riley Stone was finishing a report at the precinct when the call came in. "Old Man Hale says there's a dog scaring off his customers," dispatch said with a dry tone that meant, "We both know he doesn't have any." Riley sighed, rubbed the back of his neck, and stood. At 37, he still moved like someone trained to enter dangerous spaces first. But his uniform wasn't what it used to be. The creases were clean but softened from years of washing. A streak of grey ran through the hair just above his right temple. His badge shined only when someone got close enough to care. Maple Hollow didn't have much crime. Not since the mill closed. What it had was silence, long roads, and shadows that didn't always come from trees. Riley knew that kind of silence well. His wife had died 3 winters ago on a 2-lane highway after a logging truck jackknifed. Since then, he'd carried on like a man walking through a town that wasn't quite real anymore. But today there was a dog that refused to move. That was enough. The cruiser pulled up in front of Hale's shop. The rain had eased to a mist, but the street still shone with wet reflections. Riley stepped out slowly, adjusted his jacket, and saw the shepherd. The dog's head lifted just slightly. He didn't growl, didn't back away, just stared at Riley with deep brown eyes that held something unspoken, something both tired and unrelenting. "That's him," Vernon said from under the awning. "Same spot?" "Hasn't budged. He's not mean, just waiting." Riley crouched low, a safe distance away. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. The shepherd blinked. Then, to Vernon's astonishment, took 3 slow steps forward and rested his damp head against Riley's outstretched hand. Riley felt it like a jolt, warmth, trembling just under the surface. A body on the edge of collapse, but still holding itself upright by sheer will. And then he saw it, a cracked leather collar around the dog's neck. Tied to it, a faded blue ribbon, and tucked within, a piece of paper. Riley gently untied the ribbon and unfolded the note, shielding it from the drizzle with his palm. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible, written in the jagged, forceful strokes of a child. "I'm sorry, Scout. I can't care for you anymore. Please, someone love him." The officer stared at the paper. The dog's name was Scout. Riley looked at him again. Really looked. There was a fresh scar along the dog's hind leg, one ear bent at the tip, and ribs pressing faintly against the skin beneath the soaked coat. but his posture didn't beg. He wasn't asking for food or warmth. He was guarding something. Maybe a place. Maybe a memory. "Where'd you come from, Scout?" Riley whispered. The dog didn't move, only looked toward the door of the candy shop. Across the street, a couple of teenagers had stopped under an awning, watching. One of them pointed and said, "That dog's been out here every day since Monday." "Doesn't even bark at squirrels." Another voice joined in. Miss Clara Reeves, the school librarian, umbrella in hand. "I saw him with a little girl a few weeks ago," she said, her voice soft. "Brown hair, pink hoodie. Used to come by the shop for candy. She called him Scout Riley stood." He folded the note and placed it gently in his pocket. Then turned to Vernon. "I'm taking him in." "At least until we figure out who wrote this." Vernon gave a slow nod, his eyes lingering on the dog like he was seeing something more than just an animal. "You'll need more than dog food," he said, almost gruffly. "He's been standing in the rain for 3 damn days like he's guarding the past." Riley opened the back door of the cruiser. "Come on, Scout." The shepherd hesitated, then leapt in, calm, dignified, and utterly silent. Riley shut the door and climbed behind the wheel. For a moment he didn't start the engine. He just sat there, the weight of the folded note pressing against his heart. As the cruiser rolled down the road and faded into the fog, Vernon Hale stood alone under the awning, hands in his apron pockets. The rain had stopped, but something heavier was just beginning. The road that wound through the pines toward Riley Stone's cabin narrowed with each mile. Trees leaned in on both sides, and the forest hushed the world to a whisper. Scout lay quietly in the back seat of the cruiser, his body still tense, though his eyes were half-lidded from exhaustion. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield as Riley slowed near a faded mailbox bent at the post. The driveway beyond it was more mud than gravel. The cabin came into view like a ghost. Grey logs, slanted roof, one small porch light flickering against the dusk. It was the kind of house meant for someone who had stopped expecting visitors. Riley parked and stepped out into the damp chill. He opened the back door, but Scout didn't leap out. The shepherd looked at him instead, waiting for something. An invitation. Maybe a sign that this wasn't just another place to be left behind. "Come on," Riley said quietly. Scout moved then, careful and slow, his paws landing on the wet ground with the softest thuds. He sniffed the air, pine, wet bark, cold earth, then padded toward the porch, hesitating only at the first step. Riley unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stood back. The dog crossed the threshold like a soldier entering unfamiliar territory. Alert, watchful, still holding himself together like something inside might shatter if he let go too soon. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The furnishings were minimal, a couch worn at the arms, a small wood stove in the corner, one bookshelf holding only a few titles, and a framed photo of a woman with laughing eyes and sun-bleached hair. Her smile stretched wide, the kind that could carry a room. Riley noticed Scout glance at the photo and then look back at him. "She was my wife," Riley said, voice low. "Anna." Scout didn't respond. He just lay down by the door, curling in tight like he meant to stay but not take up space. Riley moved through the motions of settling in, changed into a dry shirt, tossed a few logs into the stove, heated up leftover stew that he barely touched. Scout didn't ask for food, didn't whine or beg. He just watched. A presence, not a burden. That night, Riley couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the shadows on the ceiling, the old ceiling fan ticking like a second hand. The house creaked around him. From the next room came the sound of breathing, steady, almost rhythmic. Scout resting near the door. At 2:47 a.m., the nightmare hit. Riley jolted awake, breath ragged, shirt soaked in sweat. The same dream. Screeching tires, the crash. Anna's voice calling his name, cut off too soon. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes, trying to stop the shaking. Then it came. Not a bark, not claws on wood, just a soft, guttural sound, a whine deep in the throat. A warning, a question, a thread being pulled through the dark. Riley sat up, heart pounding. Scout was at the bedroom door, head low, ears back. Not pacing, not panicked, just there. Present. His gaze met Riley's and held it, grounding him. In that stillness, Riley realized the dog had sensed it, the unraveling, the storm rising in his chest. He swung, his legs over the bed, and walked to the doorway. Scout didn't move away. He pressed his body gently against Riley's leg, the contact firm but not demanding. His coat was warm, still slightly damp. Riley reached down and laid a hand on his back. The dog let out a slow breath, almost like a sigh. "You too, huh?" Riley whispered. "You lost someone too?" The shepherd didn't blink, didn't flinch. He just leaned in slightly, as if to say, "I'm still here." That was the moment something shifted. By morning, Riley had placed a folded towel beside the fireplace. Scout lay there, alert but calm, his ears twitching at every noise. The house didn't feel full, not yet, but it wasn't empty either. Later that day, Riley took him outside to the backyard, a patch of grass rimmed with fence and pines. Scout sniffed cautiously, circled once, then sat near the edge like a sentinel. When Riley returned inside, he passed by Anna's photograph again. He paused, touched the frame. "I think he's staying," he said aloud. "At least for now." That night, Riley didn't dream. Or maybe he did, but it didn't drag him under like before. And sometime around dawn, he woke to a faint, familiar sound. Scout's steady breathing from the other side of the door. A rhythm not unlike Anna's once had been. A heartbeat Riley didn't know he needed to hear. By the third day, Maple Hollow knew. It didn't take long in a town that size. Not when you had Dorothy Mays sitting on her porch, arms folded, a wool shawl over her shoulders even in mild weather, and binoculars that weren't so much for bird-watching as they were for tracking everything from the mailman's arrival time to what color socks the mayor wore on Thursdays. She'd seen the cruiser pull up that evening, had leaned forward when Riley opened the back door and the dog jumped out, soaking wet and stiff-legged, but not afraid. By morning, she was on the phone with Martha Lou down by the hardware store. "Riley Stone took in a stray," she said, barely containing the tremor of purpose in her voice. "No," Martha gasped. "Not the quiet one?" "The very one. The one whose wife died on Highway 16. The one who doesn't even own a houseplant." By noon, the gas station attendant was asking customers if they'd seen the cop with the ghost dog. The librarian mentioned it to 3 different patrons. And kids walking home from school paused at the edge of the trees, hoping for a glimpse. It was Clara Jennings, the tailor's daughter, who first called the shepherd Ghost Dog. She'd seen him once through the mist, standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line near the cabin. "He's got eyes like he sees things we don't," she told her younger brother. "Like he's half here, half remembering something." The name stuck. At the diner, folks speculated. Maybe the dog's trained. Military type, said Bill Tapper between bites of hash browns. "Nah," replied Ed from the lumberyard. "He's too quiet for that. Dogs like that don't just show up unless they're searching for something." Dorothy Mays had a theory of her own. She leaned across the pew at church that Sunday and whispered to the pastor's wife, "That dog was guarding something, out there in front of the candy shop." He wasn't lost. He was holding a post. Back at the cabin, Riley didn't pay attention to the gossip. He wasn't much for town chatter, and people had always left him alone after Anna's accident. But now, Every time he came into town, stopped for coffee, filled up his cruiser, or walked into the post office, someone asked about the dog. "He's settling in," Riley would say, which wasn't a lie, but not the whole truth either. What he didn't say was that Scout kept sitting by the cabin window for long stretches, facing the direction of town. Specifically, the direction of the candy shop. Every evening, after dinner, the shepherd would rise from his towel near the stove, walk to the window, and sit. Not pace, not fidget, just sit. His posture firm, like a soldier on lookout. His eyes locked on something far beyond the trees. Riley noticed the pattern on the fifth night. He walked over, leaned on the frame, looked out with him. There was nothing but pines and the faint slope of the road. "You still waiting for her, aren't you?" Riley said. Scout flicked his ears but didn't move his gaze. Riley stood there a long time, arms crossed. The silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt like two men standing shoulder to shoulder at a graveyard, not needing to speak, only to stand. The next morning, something strange happened. Riley was walking Scout through town early, before the diner rush, just looping around the square. They passed Hale's Candy and Things. The storefront was still shuttered, pink paint peeling, the same way it had looked that rainy afternoon. And Scout stopped. Not just paused. Stopped cold. He stared at the door, posture straightening, tail lowering. Riley tried to coax him forward, but Scout wouldn't budge. His eyes were locked on the threshold like it might open at any moment. Then, without warning, Scout whined, soft and low, like a breath trapped in his throat. Riley looked at the door, then at the dog, then back again. "That's where you lost her, isn't it?" Scout sat. Riley crouched beside him. Was she a kid? A woman? Someone who meant everything? Scout didn't answer, but something in his stillness felt sharper than speech. His head dipped slightly, and he let out a sigh so long and heavy that Riley felt it in his own chest. Inside the shop, lights clicked on. Vernon Hale stepped into view, saw Riley and the dog, and came to the door. "Thought I heard something out here," the old man said. Riley stood. "You ever see a little girl with this dog?" "Few weeks back, maybe." Hale scratched his beard. "Maybe. Hard to say. But now that you mention it, I do remember a girl. Comes by for cotton candy. Brown hair, always in a braid to the side. Quiet. Looked like she hadn't had a good day in months, but she smiled when she saw the dog. He never left her side." Riley glanced at Scout, who still hadn't moved. "She used to sit right there on the steps," Hale added, pointing to the spot where Scout now sat. "Every Thursday. Like clockwork Thursday." Riley echoed. "That's tomorrow." Hale nodded, already unlocking the door. "If he comes back here on his own, let me know. That dog's holding something bigger than most of us can see." As Riley and Scout walked back up the road, the town watched again. Behind curtains, over coffee cups, beneath brims of caps and behind steering wheels. But this time, they didn't whisper. This time, they wondered. Because when a dog waits 3 days in the rain and still looks back toward the door like it might open, people remember. They remember what it means to love without conditions. And in a town like Maple Hollow, that kind of loyalty doesn't just go unnoticed. It changes things, even the hearts that tried so long not to feel. The next morning, Riley sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee and the note unfolded once again. He had read the words so many times they had etched themselves into his mind. "I'm sorry, Scout. I can't care for you anymore. Please, someone love him." The handwriting had stuck with him, the clumsy curves of each letter, the way the pencil had been pressed too hard into the paper. It wasn't just a child's handwriting, it was a desperate one. A goodbye forced too early. Scout lay by the door, watching him. Not lazily, not half asleep, but with an alertness that never really turned off, like every moment might call him back to duty. Riley leaned back in his chair and spoke out loud, more to himself than the dog. "She didn't just let you go, did she?" Scout blinked, but something in the way his ears shifted forward made Riley pause. He reached into the side drawer and pulled out the police blotter, a thin stack of handwritten reports from recent weeks. Maple Hollow didn't have a digital system, just pages and pencils. He skimmed through petty thefts, a lost wedding ring, a report of a cow loose near Route 9. Then something caught his eye. Vernon Hale's note from the day Scout was found had one additional line. Dog was last seen with young girl. Brown hair, possibly 9 or 10. Seen buying candy here before, it wasn't much. But Riley knew someone who might remember more. At the Saturday market in the square, Margaret Hill ran the bread stall. She was known as the kind of woman who saw things. Quietly, sharply, without much comment, but with deep understanding. Her son had died young from pneumonia, but she had raised 3 nieces after that, and she seemed to keep track of every child who passed through Maple Hollow. When Riley walked up to her stall, Scout at his side. She gave a short nod. "Officer Stone," she said. "Morning, Margaret. I'm looking for a girl. Around 12. Brown hair, side braid. Used to stop by Hale's for candy. Might have been seen with this dog." Margaret stilled. Her hands, which had been tying up a loaf of sourdough, paused mid-knot. Then she looked down at Scout. Her face softened. "That sounds like Emery Quinn." The name didn't ring a bell. Riley shook his head. "Lives with her grandmother," Margaret added. "On the edge of town?" "Willow Glen Road. The old farmhouse with the green roof that's turned almost black. Her folks passed last year. Pneumonia took the father, then her mother a few weeks later. Sickness moves fast in those old houses." Riley felt a small weight drop in his chest. "She's the one who wrote this," he said quietly, unfolding the note. Margaret didn't even need to read it. She simply nodded. Poor thing's been holding it together more than any child should have to. But if she gave up that dog, it must have hurt worse than she lets on. Riley looked down at Scout, who had been standing quietly beside him, but now had perked up. His ears were high, his body alert. Not tense, but eager. Riley crouched and said softly, "Scout. Emery. You know that name?" The reaction was instant. Scout barked once, low and insistent. Then he looked toward the edge of the market square where the road curved north. Riley stood. "That settles it." The ride to Willow Glen Road was quiet, except for the wind slipping through the cracked window. The forest thinned as they climbed a small ridge, and the road turned from asphalt to gravel, then to packed dirt. Houses became fewer, weeds overtook fences, and at the very end sat a farmhouse, slouched and tired, its green roof now more rust than paint. Riley parked out front. Scout didn't wait. The second the door opened, he leapt out and trotted to the bottom step of the porch. He didn't bark, didn't scratch the door. He just waited. A moment later, it creaked open. A girl stood there. Brown hair, braid off to one side, strands falling free across her cheek. Her face was thin but proud, her posture still, but the moment her eyes found Scout, everything inside her broke open. "Scout!" she whispered. Scout bounded up the steps, tail thudding, body pressed against her knees with desperate relief. Emery collapsed to the porch floor, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face into his fur. "I didn't want to leave you," she cried. "I didn't want to. I didn't know what else to do." Behind her, an elderly woman appeared, frail, leaning heavily on a cane, her breathing labored. Her eyes, though clouded, missed nothing. "You must be Officer Stone," she said softly. "Come in. We've been expecting something like this. Riley hesitated on the porch, watching the girl rock slightly as Scout licked her tears away, his body half in her lap, half guarding the door. He stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to witness. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but something told him this wasn't the end of Scout's waiting. It was only the beginning. Emery Quinn didn't run inside. She didn't scream. She simply sank where she stood, right there on the porch, legs folding beneath her as her arms wrapped around the dog that was supposed to be gone. Scout pressed her head into her shoulder, not wildly, but as if anchoring himself back into the one place in the world that had made sense. "I didn't want to leave him," Emery whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of every word. I couldn't let him starve with us." Scout responded by leaning harder into her, his body curved around hers like a living shield. His breath puffed against her cheek, hot and steady, the kind of warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Riley stood nearby, unmoving, watching a reunion that felt sacred. The porch boards creaked as the old woman behind them shifted her weight on her cane. "That dog?" she said softly, never stopped waiting. Her name was Etta Quinn, thin, hollowed by illness, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She looked at Riley the way someone sizes up a man at a funeral, not with judgment, but with the question, "Do you know what you're walking into?" He waited at the candy shop for 3 days. Riley said, his voice quiet. Etta nodded. "Because that's where she said goodbye." Scout gave a soft grunt and licked Emery's chin. The girl let out a short laugh through tears and held him tighter. "I thought he'd hate me," she said. "He doesn't know how." Riley answered. Eventually they moved inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, with a sharp undertone of alcohol and medicine. A folded quilt rested on the arm of a chair too worn to sit in. Soup simmered on the stove, but the portions were small, and the fridge clicked loudly when it tried to stay cold. Emery sat on the floor beside Scout, her hand never leaving his back. Riley took in the room. The corners were stacked with hand-labeled jars, cough tonic, foot salve, pickled beans, and a shoebox overflowing with pill bottles sat half-hidden under the table. A single photo hung above the fireplace, a young couple holding a baby with wild brown hair. Emeryetta moved slowly to a chair and settled with a groan. "We make do," she said, catching Riley's glance. "But there's not enough left for all 3 of us." "You don't have to explain," Riley said gently. Etta raised a brow. "But I do." Because when Emery came to me crying 2 weeks ago, saying she had to give up Scout, it wasn't for attention. It was for mercy. Emery looked up. "I thought he'd find someone better. Someone who could feed him." Scout let out a low breath, his head now resting on her lap. Riley stepped forward and knelt beside her. "He didn't want someone better," he said. "He wanted you." The room went still. Outside, wind rustled dry leaves across the porch. Etta coughed once, deep and rattling. Emery flinched at the sound. "We've been holding on," Etta admitted. "But the truth is, I don't have long." Riley said nothing. There was no comfort in false words. "My body's fading faster than I'd hoped," Etta continued. "And she's been the one holding everything together. Cooking, cleaning, even selling trinkets to keep the lights on." Riley looked at the girl who hadn't spoken since the fire in her chest cracked wide open on the porch. She looked back at him with the kind of tired that didn't belong in someone so young. "I didn't want him to watch her die," Emery said, her voice shaking again. "I didn't want him to see me break." Scout lifted his head and licked her cheek. "You're not broken," Riley said, "and he didn't come back to watch you fall apart." He came back to hold the pieces. Etta leaned forward slightly, her voice raspy. I can't give her what she needs anymore, Officer Stone. And I don't think I'll be around long enough to figure out what happens next. Then maybe it's time someone else steps in, Riley said. Scout shifted closer to Emery, resting his chin gently on her arm. It was an old gesture, one built from years of routine and comfort. You could have waited forever, she whispered to him. But I never would have come back. I thought you'd be better off. Scout's eyes, deep and still, held her gaze. The silence in the room grew heavy again, but not hopeless, more like a pause between one breath and the next. Finally, Riley stood. Let me help. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but maybe I can carry some of this with you. Etta looked up at him, studying the man who had shown up not just with a uniform, but with a dog who refused to leave. Scout trusts you, she said. That's not nothing. Riley nodded, and that night, when he stepped out onto the porch, he found Scout had followed him. The dog sat beside him, eyes scanning the trees, ears twitching with every rustle. She's not the only one who lost someone, Riley said, barely above a whisper. Scout didn't move, but he leaned just slightly against Riley's leg. In the quiet, it was enough. The fire came without warning. It started as a faint glow behind the hills near the edge of town, just past the Quinn house, in a forgotten outbuilding that had stood for decades without notice. To most, it was just a crooked shack leaning against time, a structure that should have collapsed years ago. But to Emery Quinn, it was everything. That shack held the last belongings of her parents, photographs sealed in tin boxes, a quilt her mother had sewn by hand, her father's tool belt, and an old cedar chest filled with letters and birthday cards faded at the edges. With the house too cramped and fragile to hold much, they had stored what little remained of her family's history there, hoping the shack would stand just long enough. It didn't. The flames moved fast. Bone-dry wood fed it like kindling, and the wind pushed it sideways in angry bursts. By the time Emery smelled smoke from her room and reached the front porch, the entire structure was a roaring inferno. She screamed, "Grandma's medicine!" It was in there too. Barefoot and panicked, she darted down the steps toward the fire, Braid flying behind her, eyes wide with terror. Scout, who had been asleep at the foot of her bed, was already racing past her. "Scout, no!" she cried. But the shepherd was gone, his dark shape cutting through the smoke as if drawn by something more powerful than fear. Riley had been on patrol when the call came through. Fire, Northern Ridge, no hydrants, neighbors trying to stop it with buckets, possible injury risk. He turned the cruiser around so hard the tires screamed. By the time he arrived, chaos had taken over. People shouted. A bell rang at the far end of the square. Water sloshed from half-filled buckets passed from hand to hand. And in the center of it all, the old shack blazed like a pyre, flames clawing at the stars. Riley jumped out of the vehicle and ran straight towards the heat. He didn't need to ask where Scout was. Emery's sobs told him everything. "He went in!" she yelled, pointing at the fire. "He went in after the chest." "My mum's chest." Smoke clawed at Riley's throat. The fire groaned like a living thing, boards snapping, nails shrieking free. And then he saw it. Through the haze, a flash of movement. Scout the shepherd appeared just inside the crumbling doorway, his teeth clamped tight on the strap of a heavy wooden trunk. He was dragging it inch by inch, his body low, shoulders straining. His coat, already singed, was glowing at the tips. "God," Riley breathed. "Hold on." He threw his jacket over his head and charged forward. The air seared his skin, but he pushed through. Reaching Scout, he grabbed the other side of the chest and pulled with everything he had. Together, man and dog backed through the flames, the weight of history grinding across scorched floorboards. They burst out just as the roof gave way. The shack collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks and smoke. Riley fell to his knees, coughing hard, dragging the chest to safety. Scout stumbled beside him, ribs heaving, eyes blinking against ash. His ears were burned at the edges, fur matted with soot. But he was alive. Emery reached them a moment later and collapsed beside Scout, wrapping her arms around him, sobbing into his side. "You saved it," she whispered. "You saved them." The crowd had gathered by then. Neighbors, townsfolk, fire volunteers who had nothing left to do but watch the fire die. They saw the burned chest, the girl crying, and the dog curled at her side with smoke still rising from his back. Not a stray, not a ghost, a hero. Vernon Hale stepped forward, his apron soaked with sweat and ash. He looked down at Scout and shook his head slowly. "That mutt just ran through hell for her," he muttered. "Ain't no stray I've ever seen." Martha Collins was there too, her coat drawn tight around her bony shoulders. She didn't say a word, but she dabbed at her eyes with the edge of her scarf, then reached out and placed a hand, just for a moment, on Scout's back. The town changed that night. Whispers turned to stories, stories turned to truth, and truth turned to reverence. Scout wasn't just the dog who had waited 3 days at the candy shop anymore. He was the one who went back into the fire, and came out carrying more than just a box. He came out carrying a family's history, a girl's heart, and the last hope that something, anything, could still be saved. The wind outside had the sharp bite of early winter, but inside the Quinn house it was another kind of cold that settled in. Etta lay beneath layers of quilts in the small back room, her breaths shallow, thin, spaced too far apart. The kind of breathing that felt more like memory than life. Emery sat beside her, clutching her hand, whispering verses from an old book with pages yellowed and edges curled. Her voice trembled, but she kept reading, even when she had to stop to wipe her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Scout lay at the bedroom door. He had not moved in hours. His body was still, ears forward, eyes alert. Not the relaxed gaze of a sleeping dog, but the intense stillness of a sentinel. He watched every shift of Etta's breath, every flicker of the candlelight. His body stayed pressed to the doorframe, as though forming a barrier between the house and whatever was coming. Riley sat on the porch steps outside, coat drawn tight, steam rising from a cup of black coffee gone cold. He hadn't left since the fire. His cruiser remained parked down the road, forgotten. He heard the rattle in Etta's lungs each time the wind shifted and the house creaked. Time had slowed. He looked toward the horizon, where the church steeple pierced the sky like a pin holding clouds in place. He thought of Anna, the way her hands had felt against his shoulders when she'd laughed, the way silence had buried him after she was gone. He knew the look in Emery's eyes now, that desperate, stretching silence waiting just beyond the last goodbye. Inside, Emery's whisper broke. "She's going, isn't she?" she said. Riley didn't answer at first. He stepped inside quietly, standing just behind Scout, looking in at the bed. Etta's hand was limp in Emery's. Her chest rose, barely. "She's tired," he said. "I can't lose both of them," Emery whispered. "Not in the same year." I can't. Scout let out a breath that sounded almost human. A slow exhale through the nose. Not defeat, just acknowledgement. That night, Riley didn't sleep. He sat in the living room with Scout nearby, both of them facing the bedroom. Hours passed like fog. Every time Emery cried, Scout's ears twitched. Every time the house settled, Riley looked up. And somewhere in that long, long night, Riley made a decision. The next morning, before the sun rose, he left. He didn't say goodbye to Emery. Didn't want her to ask where he was going. Didn't want her to hope too soon. He took the cruiser and drove into town, to the only place that opened before the bakery. The church. Pastor Evelyn Moore was already sweeping the front steps when Riley pulled up. She was in her 60s, wore denim under her robe, and had a voice that could quiet a room or break your heart depending on how she said your name. "You look like you've got the weight of someone else's world on your shoulders," she said, tapping her broom against the railing. "I need to talk," Riley said. She opened the door. Inside, Riley stood under the stained glass window depicting Noah's Ark and told her everything. The girl, the fire, the dog, the deathbed waiting behind the next sunrise. "She's 12, he said finally. "And if she loses her grandmother, she can't lose him too. Scout's the only thing that's held her together." Evelyn nodded once. "You're asking if you can carry her forward." "I'm asking how." By 9 o'clock, Riley was sitting across from Dennis Grover, the town's only lawyer, in a cramped office above the bank. Dennis wore glasses thick enough to double as magnifying lenses and had a mustache like a faded broom. He blinked slowly as Riley finished his pitch. "You want to apply for emergency guardianship of Emery Quinn?" He repeated. "Yes." "You live alone?" "I do." "No other family?" "Not anymore." Dennis leaned back and stared for a long moment. "Do you love her?" "I barely know her," Riley said honestly. "But I've seen what she's carrying. And I've seen what that dog means to her. I may not be everything she needs, but I'm willing to try." Dennis tapped his pen. "You'll need signatures. Statements. Maybe some town support. I'll get it." The lawyer nodded. "You've got 3 days before the county steps in. You want to keep her here? You'd better move fast." By noon, Riley had stopped by the school to speak with Ms. Turner, the principal. Then to the bakery, where Mrs. Callahan, who had known Etta since they were girls, offered to write a letter of recommendation. He knocked on doors. He visited the barber, the postmaster, even Martha Collins, who didn't often open her heart for anyone, but had seen Scout that night by the fire. "I'll write it," she said without waiting for an explanation. By dusk, Riley returned to the cabin for a single thing: Anna's photo. He packed it in a soft cloth and tucked it into his coat. Then he drove back to the Quinn house. Scout met him at the porch, standing like he had never moved. His eyes searched Riley's, then flicked behind him towards the door. Riley knelt and placed a hand on Scout's neck. "I'm doing it," he said quietly. "For her. For you. For all of us inside. The candlelight had faded, but Etta still breathed." Emery looked up as Riley stepped in. "Where were you?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Trying to make sure you're not alone," he replied. She blinked, unsure of what he meant. Scout curled beside her again, laying his head across her lap like a bridge between grief and whatever came next. Riley didn't push, didn't explain. He just sat nearby, listening to Etta's fading breaths and the soft sound of a dog keeping vigil for the girl who had loved him enough to let him go, and for the man who finally understood what it meant to fight for someone who hadn't asked to be saved, but still deserved to be. It rained that morning, not the violent kind that uproots trees or floods roads, but a quiet, soaking rain that fell like the sky itself was grieving. The kind of rain that didn't ask permission. It just arrived and stayed. The service was held on the edge of town at the old cemetery where Emery's parents were buried, where Etta had asked to be laid, beneath the dogwood tree that only bloomed every other year. Only a dozen people showed up. Some wore black because they thought it was expected. Others came in their Sunday best, though it was a Tuesday. A few neighbors came because they'd known Etta in passing. One man from the feed store stood at the back, hat in hand. Miss Callahan brought a pie she didn't know what to do with. And Riley, silent in his uniform, stood behind Emery as if his presence alone could shield her from the weight of the day. Scout walked beside her the entire way. He didn't wear a leash. He didn't need one. When Emery stepped out of Riley's cruiser, Scout was already waiting at her door. When she walked up the path to the burial plot, Scout stayed half a step behind her left side. When the preacher began to speak, Scout sat, his ears slightly back, rain gathering in the fur around his neck. Emery hadn't said a word all morning. She wore a navy coat that was too big, sleeves pushed up, hair still damp from the sink wash that Riley had helped her with before they left the house. Her eyes looked far older than 12. Pastor Evelyn read from Psalms, then from a poem Etta had once recited at the town fair about seasons and letting go. Her voice trembled just once on the line about what we carry forward. And when the time came to say goodbye, people stepped forward one by one. Some tossed flowers, some murmured prayers. One old man whispered, "She helped my wife get through chemo." I never said thank you. Emery stood last. She walked forward slowly, hand in coat pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of lined notebook paper. The ink had run slightly from the rain. She didn't open it, just pressed it against the casket before stepping back. That was when Riley moved. He walked to her and knelt down, not caring about the mud that splashed onto his knees, not caring about the eyes watching. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. Her lip quivered. She was everything. "I know. I don't want Scout to forget her." "He won't." She looked down at the dog. Scout sat still, eyes on the wooden box lowered into the earth. A single tremor ran through his back leg, but otherwise he didn't move, didn't whine, didn't bark, just watched, as if bearing witness was all he could offer now. Riley reached for Emery's hand. She let him take it. The moment passed in silence. Then the unexpected happened. Martha Collins, the woman who had once yelled at Scout for knocking over her trash bins, stepped forward and placed a hand on Emery's shoulder. "I brought cocoa," she said, "for after." Then the man from the feed store. "You ever want to learn how to plant tomatoes proper? I've got time." Then Miss Callahan. "Your grandma once told me you bake better than she does. I think it's time you proved it." It didn't flood Emery's face like a smile. Not yet. But something shifted in her posture. A softening. A breath she didn't know she'd held. The town wasn't changing all at once. But it was changing. Because they had seen the girl walk through fire. They had seen the dog pull her through it. And they had seen a quiet man, broken in his own way, show up when no one else had. As the casket lowered into the ground, Scout stood and took 2 steps forward. He bowed his head. Not dramatically, not trained, just low, humble, a gesture of respect. One boy in the crowd whispered, "Did you see that?" "He's mourning," someone else replied. "That dog's more human than half of us." No one argued. When the last shovel of dirt landed with a soft thud, the preacher closed her book, but no one moved. Until Scout did. He turned to Emery and gently nudged her leg, as if to say, "It's time." She nodded once. Hand in Riley's, with Scout at her side, Emery walked back down the path. Behind them, the town followed, not just out of respect for the dead, but out of recognition for the living. For the girl who stayed, for the man who chose her, and for the dog who never left. The first sign came from the candy shop. Riley hadn't even walked Emery into town that day expecting anything. She needed fresh air. He needed a break from the paperwork that came with applying for guardianship. Scout trotted beside them, alert but relaxed, his head turning at the sound of every distant bell or tire on gravel. The storm had passed, and the town looked washed, like someone had taken a cloth to the sky. They stopped in front of Vernon's candy shop, because Emery stared at the window too long. Not at the chocolates, but at the tiny glass dog figurine sitting in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of caramels. Vernon spotted them through the window and swung the door open. "Wait there," he said, eyes red-rimmed, tie crooked. He disappeared into the back and returned with a paper bag and the figurine. "Your grandma used to buy licorice sticks every Sunday after church. Said it kept her young. These were her favorite." He handed the bag to Emery and then gently placed the glass dog in Riley's hand. "For him," Vernon said, nodding at Scout. "Figured he earned it." Riley tried to pay. Vernon shook his head. "It's not for sale." It's gratitude that was the first time Riley realized the town was watching, and something had changed. Later that week, Mrs. Callahan stopped by with a casserole and an envelope tucked beneath it. Inside was a handwritten note with 3 $20 bills and a list of others who had pitched in. The note read, "For the girl," and the man who didn't walk away. Then came the blacksmith. Riley had never spoken more than 2 words to him before, but one afternoon, Riley found a hand-forged nameplate in his mailbox. Scout Guardian. The town had started something without asking permission, and Riley didn't know how to respond to it at first, because for years he'd been a man with routines, not roots. Wake up, check the fence, keep the nightmares buried in the back of his mind. Scout had been the only consistent thing after the war. Scout had been his mission. He thought he was keeping a promise to a dog. But now, standing in the kitchen while Emery did her homework and Scout lay under her feet, twitching slightly in sleep, Riley felt something crack open inside him. That night, he pulled a box from the hall closet. Inside were clippings from his unit, folded letters from buddies long gone, and the discharge papers he hadn't looked at in 6 years. She looked up, surprised. "You never told me that." "I didn't think I had to." They sat in silence a while. Scout stirred, stretched, and laid his head on Riley's boot. "You know," Riley said, "I thought I was just keeping a promise to a dog." Emery tilted her head. "And?" "Turns out he was keeping one to me." The words caught in his throat a little, but he let them land. Emery smiled, not wide, but real. She reached under the table and rested her hand on Scout's back. They didn't need to say more. 2 days later, Riley stood on the steps of the town courthouse, papers in hand, Scout at his side. He wasn't in uniform, but he stood straight, chin up. Not for show, for respect. He handed the forms to the clerk. "Petition for permanent guardianship," he said. The clerk smiled. "About time, Riley." As he turned to leave, he noticed the hardware store had a new poster in the window. Community Support Fund for Emery and Scout. He didn't know who started it. Maybe the teacher, maybe the florist, maybe someone else who had seen what Scout had done when no one else had. But he knew this. The town that once looked through him now looked to him. And all of it started with a dog who refused to leave a girl's side. Not just a dog. Scout the Guardian. The bridge. And perhaps the town's second chance. The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long golden streaks across the wooden benches. It was a Monday morning, early enough that traffic hadn't quite picked up, and yet the gallery was full. Not with strangers. With a town. The candy shop owner sat in the second row, holding a small paper bag in his lap. Mrs. Callahan dabbed her eyes with a floral handkerchief. The blacksmith leaned forward on the edge of his seat. Even the mail carrier had come on her day off. No one said it, but everyone felt it. Something was about to be made right. At the front of the room, Riley sat stiff-backed, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, hair combed, jaw set. Emery was beside him in a soft blue dress her grandmother had once tucked away for a special day. She fidgeted, cheeks pink, but kept glancing at Scout as if drawing strength from the dog's calm, quiet presence. Scout sat between them like he'd always belonged there. Not a pet, not a mascot, A witness, a bridge, a guardian. The judge adjusted his glasses, reviewing the folder in front of him. "Mr. Walsh," he said, voice even, "you are filing for full legal guardianship of Miss Emery Hart, age 9. Are you prepared for the responsibilities this entails?" Riley swallowed. "I am, Your Honor." "And Miss Hart?" The judge turned, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Do you wish for Mr. Walsh to become your guardian?" Emery looked up at the judge. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than a whisper. "I already think of him as family." The judge nodded, made a note. "Any objections?" Silence. Then a voice from the back row, a deep, gravelly voice, unfamiliar. "I do." Gasps rippled through the room. A man stepped forward. Late 50s, greasy suit, unshaven. He held a crumpled document in his hand. "I'm her uncle," he announced. "Next of kin. And I want custody." Riley stood, chest tightening. He'd heard whispers about an estranged relative, someone who vanished when Emery's mother died. But he'd never expected this. "Mr. Jensen," the judge said, eyes narrowing. "You were contacted 6 times in the past year. You never responded." The man shrugged. Didn't know she had anything worth showing up for. "Now I do." Riley stepped forward, calm but firm. "She's not a paycheck. She's a child, and she's home now." Scout stood, growling low. The judge raised a hand. "Enough." The silence that followed was cold. Then Emery did something no one expected. She rose, stepped down from her seat, and stood between Riley and the stranger. "He didn't come when Grandma was sick," she said softly. "He didn't come when I cried at night. He didn't come when I needed someone to hold my hand. But he came now, because other people came first, because Scout stayed, because Mr. Riley stayed." She turned, looking up at Riley. "Thanks, Dad." The word hit the room like a chord struck true. Scout let out a soft huff and sat again, pressed against Riley's leg like he knew his job was done. The judge cleared his throat, eyes misty. "Motion denied," he said to the uncle. "Custody granted to Mr. Riley Walsh." Effective immediately, applause broke out, scattered and emotional. Riley didn't move. He just reached down and put a hand on Scout's head. Later, outside the courthouse, the sun had fully broken through the clouds. Emery chased a swirl of leaves on the sidewalk, her laughter echoing down the street. Riley stood by the steps, hands in his pockets, watching her. A woman approached, someone from the gallery. She didn't speak, just handed him a folded piece of paper and walked away. He opened it. One sentence. "Thank you for listening when no one else did." Riley looked down at Scout. "You heard her first," he said. And in that moment, Scout looked up, not wagging, not barking, just present, like always. At the edge of the steps, Emery called back, "Come on, Dad!" Riley smiled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was filling a void. He was part of something. Scout trotted ahead, tail low but happy, flanking Emery like the silent protector he'd always been, and in that light, that warmth, came a quiet question. Maybe not spoken aloud, but felt deep. What about you? Has anyone, animal or human, ever stayed for you when no one else did? If Scout's story moved you, if you believe no child should be left without a listener, and no hero should be forgotten, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, then subscribe to German Shepherd Stories. Honor the ones who stay.